Long before the tall ships broke the horizon of the Atlantic, bringing with them the iron clamor of the Old World and the fever of conquest, there existed a silence. It was not an empty silence, but a living one, a deep, resonant vibration held within the emerald embrace of the Mesoamerican jungles. Picture, if you will, the world as it was when the continents were still strangers to one another. Here, in the cradle of the Americas, the earth breathed with a heavy, humid rhythm. The canopy of the rainforest was a kingdom unto itself, a vast, tangled ocean of green where sunlight struggled to pierce the leaves, falling only in shafts of dusty, sacred gold upon the forest floor. In this primordial cathedral, time did not tick in seconds or minutes. It moved in the slow cycles of the sun, the moon, and the rot of fallen trees feeding new life. And here, amidst the stone temples of the Maya and the Aztec civilizations that rose like limestone mountains from the jungle floor, a specific plant grew wild and potent. It was not the delicate, manicured crop we know today, neatly rowed in the fields of Virginia or Kentucky. This was Nicotiana rustica, a wild, violent ancestor, with broad, sticky green leaves that drank the humidity of the earth and turned it into a bitter, potent chemistry. To the modern eye, it might have looked like a weed, a simple scrub brush clinging to the riverbanks and the clearings where the jaguar stalked. But to the ancient peoples of this land, it was a being with a soul. It was a botanical divinity. In the cosmology of the Americas, everything possessed a spirit: the stone, the river, the jaguar, and the leaf. But the tobacco plant held a unique and terrifying power. It was believed that the gods themselves craved the smoke, that the rising gray plumes were the only ladder between the mortal soil and the celestial heavens. It was the medium of conversation between the seen and the unseen, a fragile, gray thread stitching the universe together. Let us drift back across the centuries, descending into the heart of a Mayan city at the height of the Classic period. The air is thick with the scent of damp limestone and decaying orchids. The pyramids rise in steps toward the stars, painted in red and blue, mirroring the constellations above. It is night. The jungle is a chorus of insects and night birds, a wall of sound that surrounds the city. In the center of the plaza, a fire burns, casting long, dancing shadows against the carved stelae of kings and conquerors. Here, we find the shaman, the keeper of wisdom, the bridge between the worlds. In the hands of the shaman, the dried leaf was crumbled with a reverence reserved for the bones of ancestors. This was a sacrament of the soul. The preparation was slow, a ritual in itself. The leaves had been gathered by hand, chosen for their potency, and dried in the sun until they turned the color of the earth itself, a deep, rich brown. They were mixed with lime, with ash, sometimes with the bark of other psychoactive trees, creating a mixture that was less a recreational indulgence and more a spiritual weapon. When fire finally kissed the plant, it did not merely burn, it spoke. The smoke that curled from the clay pipes or the rolled bundles of maize leaves was not the smooth, mild vapor of modern commerce. It was thick, biting, and incredibly heavy. It tasted of the wild earth, of dark soil and bitter alkaloids. To inhale it was to invite a spirit into the body. The nicotine content of this ancient plant was staggering, high enough to induce immediate physiological shock. For the shaman, this was the goal. The trembling of the hands, the racing of the heart, the sudden wave of nausea, these were not side effects. They were the knocking of the spirit at the door of consciousness. They used this smoke to induce visions, to peel back the curtain of reality and see the gears of the universe turning. Under the influence of the sacred breath, the shaman would travel. His spirit would leave the heavy anchor of the body and fly on the back of the smoke, ascending the 13 levels of the heavens or descending into the 9 levels of Xibalba, the underworld. There, amidst the lords of death and the celestial architects, he would plead for rain, for the health of the king, or for the location of lost souls. There was no concept of addiction here, in the way we understand the clinical hook of a chemical dependency. There was only a deep, vibrating connection to the divine, a relationship of reciprocity where the human offered the smoke, and the gods, in turn, offered guidance. It was the breath of the earth exhaling into the night sky, a sacred incense that wrapped the ancient world in a blanket of fragrant, heavy mystery. But the relationship with the plant was not limited to the high priests and the temple tops. It permeated the very fabric of life. In the humble huts of the common people, tobacco was a guardian. It was medicine in its purest form. A paste of tobacco and lime was rubbed onto swollen limbs to drive out the winds of pain. The smoke was blown gently over the faces of feverish children to scare away the malevolent spirits that heated the blood. Hunters would blow smoke into the nostrils of their dogs to sharpen their scent, and then into the forest itself, asking the guardians of the deer to forgive them for the hunt that was to come. This was a world where the distinction between medicine, magic, and religion did not exist. They were one single, flowing river of understanding. The plant was the key to all three. To smoke was to pray. To smoke was to heal. To smoke was to remember. Consider the Temple of the Cross at Palenque, where carvings depict the gods themselves smoking. We see the image of the old god, God El, the lord of the underworld, sitting on his jaguar skin throne, comfortable in the dark, with a long cigar clamped in his mouth. The smoke he exhales forms the clouds that bring the rain. This is a profound metaphor. Just as the clouds gather to water the maize that feeds the people, the smoke gathers to feed the gods who sustain the world. The cycle of smoke and rain, of fire and water, was the heartbeat of agricultural survival. Without the tobacco smoke to mimic the clouds, the rains might fail, the maize might wither, and the sun might refuse to rise. As we move north from the jungles of the Maya to the high plateaus of Mexico and the Aztec Empire, the leaf takes on an even more martial and bloody significance. The Aztecs, the people of the sun, were a culture of flowers and wars, of poetry and sacrifice. They called the plant yetl. In the great markets of Tenochtitlan, the island city that floated on Lake Texcoco like a dream, merchants sold tobacco in gilded reeds, flavored with liquid ambar, vanilla, and flowers. It was a luxury of the elite, a sign of nobility, but it was also a tool of the warrior. Before battle, Aztec soldiers would carry gourds of tobacco powder around their necks. The plant was a stimulant, a way to banish fatigue and fear, to steel the nerves against the clash of obsidian blades and the scream of the death whistle. It gave them the endurance to march for days and the ferocity to capture enemies for the altar. Yet, even in this warrior culture, the spiritual tenderness remained. When a merchant prepared for a long journey, he would offer tobacco to the fire, speaking to the flames as one speaks to a grandfather, asking for a safe path and a profitable return. The duality of the plant's ability to comfort and its ability to kill was understood, though not in the medical terms of the modern age. They knew it was a poison. To swallow the juice was death. To smoke too much was to fall into a drunkenness that could shatter the mind. But this danger was part of its holiness. In the ancient world, power was never safe. The gods were not benevolent grandfathers. They were terrifying forces of nature, like the hurricane or the earthquake. To commune with them required a substance that walked the line between life and death. The tobacco plant, with its roots in the dark soil and its smoke reaching for the sun, was the perfect ambassador for this dangerous diplomacy. Drift further north now, carried by the trade winds of history, to the vast prairies and the woodlands of North America. Here, the plant's influence stretched like a great vine across the continent. Among the tribes of the plains and the eastern woodlands, the calumet, the sacred pipe, became the central pillar of diplomacy and truth. The pipe was not merely a tool for smoking, it was an altar you could hold in your hands. Carved from red catlinite stone, representing the blood of the earth, and fitted with a wooden stem representing the plant kingdom, the pipe united the elements. When strangers met on the high plains, where the buffalo moved in herds like thunderclouds across the grass, the pipe was produced before a single word was spoken. To smoke together was to share breath, and to share breath was to merge spirits. It was impossible to lie while holding the pipe, for the smoke carried one's words directly to the Creator. A lie spoken in smoke was a cosmic crime, a severance of the bond between man and the Great Spirit. Treaties were sealed not with ink on paper, which can be burned or forgotten, but with smoke that vanished into the air, becoming part of the atmosphere that everyone breathed. The promise, once smoked, was woven into the sky itself. In these northern rituals, we see the profound gentleness of the plant's history, a sharp contrast to the industrialized addiction that would come later. The act of smoking was slow. It was communal. The pipe was passed from hand to hand, following the direction of the sun. Each participant would take only a few puffs, 4 perhaps, to honor the 4 directions before passing it on. It was a ceremony of silence and contemplation, a way to slow the heart and open the mind to the thoughts of others. In the long, cold winters, inside the bark longhouses or the buffalo hide teepees, the smell of tobacco, mixed with red willow bark or bearberry, was the smell of home, of safety, of a story being told while the snow piled high against the walls. This was the golden age of the leaf, though not golden in terms of coin or commerce. It was golden in its sanctity. For thousands of years, from the Andes to the Arctic, the plant lived in a symbiotic balance with humanity. It was cultivated with care, harvested with prayer, and consumed with intention. It was not a habit, it was a relationship. The plant was a teacher, a healer, and a guide. It demanded respect, and in return, it offered solace. But history is a river that flows toward the sea of change, and the isolation of the Americas could not last forever. While the shamans of the Maya were blowing smoke over their jade idols, and the elders of the Iroquois were passing the pipe beneath the white pine trees, the world across the ocean was restless. In the ports of Europe, men were building ships of oak and canvas, driven by a hunger for spices, for gold, and for the unknown. They knew nothing of the green leaf. They knew nothing of the smoke that healed. They were sailing toward a collision that would shatter the silence of the ancient world. The plant, in its botanical wisdom, waited. It stood in the fields, its flowers blooming under the moon, its seeds ready to travel. It is a strange thought, is it not? That a plant could change the destiny of the world. We often think of history as being shaped by kings and generals, by the sword and the pen. But the history of the world is also written in the biography of seeds. Wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, these quiet architects built civilizations. And tobacco, the dark sister of the nightshade family, was preparing to build an empire of its own, an empire not of food, but of desire. Picture the year 1492. The date hangs in history like a bell tolling the end of an era. 3 small wooden ships, battered by the Atlantic, drift toward the Bahamas. The sailors are weary, their eyes stinging from the salt spray, their minds filled with fear of the edge of the world. When they finally stepped onto the white sands of the island they would call San Salvador, they were met by the Taino people. The meeting was a clash of 2 universes. The Europeans brought glass beads, red caps, and hawks' bell trinkets of the material world. The Taino brought parrots, balls of cotton thread, and dried leaves which they held in high esteem. Columbus, the admiral of the ocean sea, looked at the dried brown leaves with confusion. He saw them as worthless debris, perhaps a strange form of potpourri. He did not know that he was holding the most potent commodity in the history of capitalism. He did not know that these crumbling leaves would one day be worth more than the gold he so desperately sought. He threw them away, or perhaps traded them idly, unaware that he had just been handed the keys to a kingdom of smoke. It was his men who would eventually discover the secret. 2 sailors, sent to explore the interior of Cuba, returned with a report that sounded like madness. They had seen men and women walking with firebrands in their hands, rolling herbs in dried leaves, lighting one end and drinking the smoke. The Spaniards watched in horror and fascination. To the medieval Christian mind, smoke belonged to the devil. It was the atmosphere of hell. To see a human being exhaling clouds seemed like a demonic possession. And yet, curiosity is a powerful tide. It pulls at the edges of fear until it erodes it. The sailors, far from home, surrounded by the alien sounds of the jungle, were drawn to the comfort they saw on the faces of the natives. They saw the calm that descended after the smoke was inhaled. They saw the communal bond it created. And so, tentatively, with a mixture of dread and daring, they tried it. This moment, the first time a European lungs filled with the smoke of the New World, was a turning point in the biological history of our species. It was the moment the barrier broke. The sacred breath of the gods was about to become the bewitching vegetable of the common man. The plant, which had stayed within the boundaries of the Americas for millennia, held in check by ritual and reverence, was about to be unleashed. But let us pause here, in this moment of first contact, before the ships return to Spain, before the plantations rise, before the factories hum. Let us linger in the emerald silence one last time. Picture the shaman standing on the steps of the temple as the sun sets, the sky turning a bruised purple. He lights his pipe. The smoke rises, straight and true, dissolving into the twilight. He believes he is speaking to the gods, keeping the world in balance. He does not know that the white sails on the horizon signal the end of his world and the beginning of a new, smoky epoch. He only knows the scent of the leaf, the warmth of the fire, and the peace of the ritual. The tobacco plant in its wild innocence grows nearby, its leaves heavy with the dew of the evening. It is a masterpiece of evolution, a chemical factory designed to defend itself, now repurposed to comfort the human soul. It is the golden leaf of lethal comfort, waiting for the winds of change to carry it away, to conquer the lungs of kings and paupers alike, to weave itself into the breath of humanity. The sacred incense is about to become a global addiction, but here, in the ancient dark, it is still just a prayer, rising slowly, beautifully, into the void. The transition from the sacred to the profane is rarely sudden. It is a slow erosion, like water wearing down stone. As the Spanish caravels turned their prows eastward, laden with the treasures of the Indies, the dried leaves were tucked away in sea chests, nestled between gold ingots and exotic feathers. They were curiosities, souvenirs of a savage world. But on the long, grueling voyage back to Europe, the sailors found themselves returning to the leaf. The Atlantic is a cold, lonely place. The work of a sailor is hard, the food is poor, and the fear of storms is constant. In the dark of the forecastle, amidst the creaking of timber and the smell of unwashed bodies, the smoke offered a respite. It dulled the hunger. It warmed the chest against the damp chill. It provided a moment of calm in a life of chaos. The sailors, without knowing it, were the first converts to a new religion. They were not smoking to commune with Quetzalcoatl or to bring rain for the harvest. They were smoking to survive the night. The ritual had been stripped of its theology and reduced to its pharmacology. The God within the plant had become a fix. When they arrived in the ports of Lisbon and Seville, they brought the habit with them. Picture the scene on the stone quays of 16th century Europe. The city is a labyrinth of narrow cobblestone streets, crowded, noisy, and reeking of waste. Into this world steps the sailor, sun-weathered and strange, exhaling a cloud of aromatic smoke. The people stop and stare. It is a spectacle. Some run in fear, believing the man is on fire from the inside. Others lean in, captivated by the sweet, musky scent that hangs in the air long after the sailor has passed. The spread of the leaf through Europe was not immediate. It was a slow contagion. At first, it was viewed with deep suspicion. The Church saw it as a vice of the heathens, a tool of Satan to cloud the minds of good Christians. Indeed, one of Columbus's crewmen, Rodrigo de Jerez, famously brought the habit back to his hometown. When his wife saw him blowing smoke from his mouth and nose, she denounced him to the Inquisition. He was thrown into a dungeon, condemned for performing a miracle that only the devil could perform. But here is the supreme irony of history. While Rodrigo sat in his cell, the habit he was imprisoned for was spreading through the very society that condemned him. By the time he was released, years later, people were smoking in the streets. The leaf had outpaced the law. It had tapped into a fundamental human need, the need for a small, controllable pleasure in a life often defined by suffering. The apothecaries and the alchemists, always searching for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, took the plant into their laboratories. They examined it with the tools of the emerging scientific revolution. They distilled it, boiled it, and crushed it, and they came to a conclusion that would fuel the plant's rise for the next 300 years. They decided it was a medicine. It is difficult for us, looking back through the lens of modern oncology and heart disease, to comprehend the fervor with which tobacco was hailed as a panacea, a cure-all. But we must remember the context of the time. Medicine was a grim affair of bleeding, purging, and superstition. Pain was a constant companion. In this landscape of suffering, tobacco seemed like a gift from God. It numbed pain, it suppressed hunger, it cleared the phlegm, it calmed the nerves. Jean Nicot, the French diplomat to Portugal, whose name is forever immortalized in the word nicotine, sent the plant to Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France. He recommended it for her migraines. Picture the Queen of France, one of the most powerful women in Europe, crumbling the dried leaf into a fine powder and inhaling it into her royal nose. The headache, perhaps due to the stimulation or the placebo effect, lifted. The endorsement was absolute. If the Queen used it, the court used it. If the court used it, the merchants used it. The Queen's herb, as it came to be known, was suddenly the height of fashion. The leaf had successfully molted. It had shed the wild, jaguar skin persona of the jungle and donned the velvet and lace of the Renaissance. It moved from the clay pipes of the shaman to the silver snuff boxes of the aristocracy. It was no longer the breath of the earth, it was the powder of the mind. Intellectuals claimed it sharpened their thoughts. Poets claimed it unlocked the muse. The cloud of smoke became a symbol of the contemplative life, a visual representation of deep thought. But beneath the powdered wigs and the gilded snuff boxes, the chemistry of the plant remained unchanged. The ancient molecule was doing its work, silently rewiring the neural pathways of a continent. The sacred breath was becoming the daily bread of the nervous system. The plant was conquering the world, not by the sword, but by the whisper of relief it offered to the anxious human brain. As the 16th century bled into the 17th, the demand for the leaf began to outstrip the supply. The small gardens in Europe could not grow enough of the tropical plant to satisfy the craving that was sweeping the nations. The eyes of the world turned back to the Americas, not as a place of discovery, but as a place of production. The emerald silence of the jungle was about to be broken by the sound of axes. The land where the plant was once a god was about to become a factory. The story of tobacco is the story of globalization. It is the thread that ties together the indigenous farmer, the Spanish sailor, the French queen, and the English merchant. It is a story of how a single species of plant, evolved in the isolation of the Americas, managed to seduce the entire human race. It appealed to our spiritual longing, our physical pain, and our social vanity. It was a shapeshifter, becoming whatever the user needed it to be. A prayer, a medicine, a luxury, a companion. But as the ships began to cross the Atlantic in greater numbers, filling their holds with the golden leaf, a shadow was lengthening across the New World. The hunger for tobacco would drive the demand for land. The demand for land would drive the displacement of the very people who had first discovered the plant's secrets. And the demand for labor to work that land would give rise to a tragedy that would stain the soul of history. The smoke that was once used to seal peace treaties was about to become the fuel for a system of unimaginable cruelty. Yet, in these early days, before the plantations of Virginia, before the great auction blocks, the leaf still held a trace of its old magic. It was still new enough to be wondrous. It was still a mysterious traveler from a lost world. When a man in London or Amsterdam lit his pipe in the evening, watching the smoke swirl in the candlelight, he was participating in a ritual that was thousands of years old. He was touching the hem of the ancient gods, even if he did not know their names. He was inhaling the breath of the jungle, the memory of the rain, and the wild, untamed spirit of the Americas. The golden leaf had arrived, and it promised comfort. It promised warmth. It promised a moment of peace in a troubled world. And the world, tired and thirsty for solace, opened its arms and breathed it in. The lethal nature of the comfort would not be fully understood for centuries. For now there was only the smoke, rising like a prayer, drifting through the corridors of history, quiet, elegant, and inescapable. The world was vast, terrifyingly open, and largely composed of water. Picture, if you will, the endless, churning gray of the Atlantic Ocean in the waning months of 1492. It was a liquid wilderness that swallowed the horizon, a place where the map ended and the realm of sea monsters and abyss began. Upon this indifferent expanse, 3 wooden ships bobbed like splinters of driftwood. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria were not the majestic vessels of later centuries. They were cramped, leaking arks of desperation, smelling of tar, unwashed bodies, and the vinegar used to scrub the decks. The hulls creaked with a rhythmic, mournful groan, a sound that had been the lullaby for these sailors for weeks on end. They were men suspended between a home that was fading from memory and a destination that existed only in the fevered calculations of their Genoese admiral. When land finally broke the monotony of the blue, a dark smudge against the rising sun that solidified into the lush greens of Guanahanit felt less like a discovery and more like a salvation. But as the longboats cut through the turquoise surf and ground against the white sand, the eyes of the old world were about to widen in a way they never had before. They were stepping not just onto a new continent, but into a new sensory dimension. The air was different here. It was thick, perfumed with unknown pollens, heavy with a humidity that felt like a warm hand pressing against the skin. And amidst the parrots and the strange fruits, they encountered the people of the Taino, a gentle culture living in what seemed to the starving sailors like the Garden of Eden before the fall. It was in this initial, fragile period of contact that the Devil's Torch was first illuminated for European eyes. On a day recorded in the Admiral's logbooks, 2 men, Luis de Torres, a converted Jew who spoke Arabic and Hebrew, and Rodrigo de Jerez, a neighbor of the Admiral, were sent inland to scout. They were looking for the great Khan of China, for cities of gold and roofs of silver. Instead, they found thatched huts, hammocks woven from cotton, and a ritual that froze the blood in their veins. Picture the scene through the lens of a medieval mind. These were men raised in the shadow of the Inquisition, in a world where fire was the instrument of damnation. Fire was the punishment for the heretic. Smoke was the atmosphere of hell. To see a human being voluntarily consume fire was to witness a violation of natural law. They watched as the natives took dried, brown leaves, rolled them into large, rough cylinders which they called tobaccos, and lit one end with a firebrand. The Taino men would then place the other end in their mouths, inhale deeply, and, to the horror of the Spaniards, exhale thick, gray clouds from their mouths and nostrils. It was a spectacle of dragons. To the observers, it seemed as though the natives were burning from the inside out, yet they did not scream. Instead, a look of profound, glassy-eyed peace would settle over their faces. The smoke wreathed their heads like a halo, dissipating into the jungle canopy. De Torres and de Jerez stood rooted to the spot, caught between revulsion and a magnetic curiosity. They were witnessing the friction point of 2 hemispheres, the moment where the sacred ritual of the Americas collided with the superstitious fear of Europe. The drinking of smoke, as they called it, was incomprehensible, but the curiosity of the explorer is a powerful tide, stronger even than the fear of the devil. The ocean is a cruel mistress. She strips a man of his comforts, his warmth, and his sleep. The sailors were weary, their bones aching from the damp, their gums bleeding from scurvy, their nerves frayed by the terror of the unknown. They watched the Taino. They saw the relaxation of the muscles, the easing of the burden, the communal bonding that occurred when the firebrand was passed. They saw that the demons did not come to claim the smokers. Instead, the smokers seemed to float above their earthly pains. We do not know the exact moment the barrier was breached, the precise second when a rough Spanish hand first reached out to take the glowing roll of leaves. But we can imagine the hesitation. The weight of the primitive cigar in the hand, surprisingly light. The heat radiating from the ember. The smell, pungent, earthy, sharper than the incense of the cathedral, smelling of soil and dried sun. And then, the first inhalation. It would have been a violent experience. The tobacco of the Caribbean was Nicotiana rustica, a potent, wild strain with a nicotine content far higher than modern commercial varieties. The smoke would have hit the throat like a physical blow, a hot, acrid scratch that triggered immediate coughing. The lungs, virgin to smoke, would have spasmed. The head would have spun as if the sailor were back on the heaving deck of the ship during a storm. Nausea would have risen in the gorge. But then, as the coughing subsided, the chemistry took hold. A strange, heavy warmth would have spread through the limbs, starting at the fingertips and moving inward. The gnawing hunger in the belly, the constant companion of the sailor, would have faded into a dull background hum. The sharp edge of anxiety about the voyage home, about the storms, about the captain's madness would have blunted. For a man living a life of supreme hardship, this sudden, dizzying comfort was a miracle. It was a lullaby for exhausted nerves. It was a way to numb the biting reality of their existence. The transition from Devil's Torch to Sailor's Secret happened in the dark corners of the Caribbean night. By the time the ships were prepared to leave, the leaf was no longer a curiosity. It was a cargo. It was gathered not in the tons that would later define the trade, but in handfuls, tucked away in velvet pouches or wrapped in oilcloth, hidden deep in the sea chests alongside stolen gold trinkets and colorful feathers. The sailors were bringing a piece of the New World's soul back with them, unaware that they were carrying a biological conqueror. The return voyage across the Atlantic is a chapter of history often glossed over, but picture the atmosphere below the decks of the Niña as she limped back toward Spain in early 1493. The weather was ferocious. The seas were mountains of gray water crashing down on the fragile wood. Below, in the damp, fetid darkness, the air would have been thick with a new scent. It was the smell of secrets. Men huddled together, lighting the dried leaves with trembling hands, sharing the smoke that made the cold seem less penetrating and the darkness less absolute. This was the incubation period of the global habit. The ship was a moving laboratory. The sailors learned how to keep the leaves dry, how to roll them, how to regulate the burn. They became the high priests of a new underground religion. They did not have the spiritual context of the Taino. They did not blow smoke to the four winds or ask the jaguar spirit for guidance. They smoked for survival. They smoked to feel human in an inhuman environment. The sacred connection to the divine was being replaced by the chemical connection to the self. And then, the wooden hulls scraped against the familiar stones of the old world. The anchor chains rattled down into the harbor mud. Europe lay before them, a continent of stone castles, narrow streets, and rigid dogmas. The sailors stepped ashore, walking with the rolling gait of men used to the sea, carrying their secret in their pockets. The story now focuses on one man, the tragic protagonist of this chapter, Rodrigo de Jerez. He was one of the first to witness the smoking in Cuba, and he had become a devotee of the leaf. He returned to his hometown of Ayamonte in southwestern Spain, a place of whitewashed walls and intense Catholic scrutiny. He was a hero, a man who had seen the edge of the world and returned. But he brought back a habit that the town could not comprehend. Picture the domestic scene, tragic in its innocence. Rodrigo's in his own home, perhaps sitting by the hearth after a meal. He misses the camaraderie of the ship. He misses the warmth of the Caribbean sun. He reaches for his pouch. He takes out the dried leaves. He rolls them. He lights them. His wife enters the room. She expects to see her husband. Instead, she sees a man with smoke billowing from his mouth and nose. The smell is alien, pungent, filling the small room. In the flickering light of the hearth, the sight is terrifying. To a 15th century Spanish woman, there is only one explanation for a man who breathes smoke. He is on fire from within. And if he is on fire from within but not burning to ash, he must be possessed. He has become a vessel for the fires of purgatory. She screams. The neighbors come running. They peer through the windows and the open door. They see Rodrigo confused, perhaps holding out the cigar to explain, surrounded by the gray haze. The fear spreads like contagion. This is not just a strange habit. It is a spiritual crisis. The local priest is summoned. The whispers turn to accusations. The devil, they say. Only the devil can give a man the power to breathe smoke. The Inquisition, the holy office that acted as the guardian of the soul of Spain, was swift and merciless. Rodrigo de Jerez was not treated as an innovator or an explorer. He was treated as a suspect. He was arrested, dragged from his home, and thrown into the dark stone belly of a prison. The irony is crushing. The man who had braved the unknown ocean, who had walked in the jungles of a new world, was imprisoned by the ignorance of the old one. He was locked away for the crime of smoking, a crime that within a century would become the fashionable habit of kings and popes. Rodrigo remained in prison for 7 long years, 7 years of silence, 7 years of darkness. While he sat in his cell, wondering if he would ever see the sun or the sea again, a strange phenomenon was occurring just outside the prison walls. The walls could contain the man, but they could not contain the aroma. They could not contain the idea. The sailors who had served with him, and the sailors who came after them on subsequent voyages, were not arrested. There were too many of them, and they were too transient. They moved like ghosts through the port cities of Lisbon, Seville, and Cadiz. They frequented the taverns, the brothels, and the docksides, and wherever they went, they smoked. Picture the docks of Seville in the early 1500s. It is the center of the world, the gateway to the Indies. The river Guadalquivir is choked with masts. The air smells of tar, spices, rotting fish, and horse manure. But cutting through this sensory cacophony is a thin, blue ribbon of scent. It is sweet, earthy, and compelling. A dock worker sees a sailor leaning against a barrel, smoking a rough cigar. He asks what it is. The sailor, with a grin that hints at illicit knowledge, offers him a puff. The cough comes first, just as it did in the Caribbean, but then comes the rush. The dock worker, his back aching from lifting crates of olive oil, feels the pain recede. He feels the sudden clarity of mind. He asks where he can get this Indian weed, and a transaction is made. A few leaves are traded for a coin or a drink. The seed is planted. This was the sailor's secret. It was a fraternity of the smoke, a brotherhood that transcended language and nationality. It spread from the Spanish to the Portuguese, from the Portuguese to the French and the Dutch. It traveled along the trade routes, carried in the pockets of men who lived hard lives and died young. It was the perfect drug for the age of exploration. It did not intoxicate to the point of incapacitation like alcohol. A man could smoke and still climb the rigging, still fight with a sword, still count coins. It was a functional vice. By the time Rodrigo de Jerez was finally released from his prison cell, blinking into the harsh Spanish sunlight, the world had changed. He walked through the streets of Ayamonte and saw respectable men smoking openly. The devil's torch had been domesticated. It was no longer the sign of possession. It was becoming a sign of sophistication, or at least a common comfort. The tragedy of his imprisonment was absolute. He was the martyr of the leaf, the first casualty in the long war between tobacco and society. But the leaf itself did not care for martyrs. It only cared for expansion. It moved inland, away from the spray of the sea. It found its way into the pockets of soldiers marching to the wars of Europe. It found its way into the studies of scholars who sought to understand the botany of the New World. It found its way into the gardens of the wealthy, who planted it alongside their roses and tulips, marveling at its tall stalk and pink flowers. The spread was driven by the climate of the times. The 16th and 17th centuries were eras of profound physical discomfort. Houses were cold and damp. Medicine was primitive and painful. Dental hygiene was non-existent. The average person lived with a constant background noise of minor aches, hunger, and cold. Into this life of gray stone and shivering flesh, tobacco brought a spark of artificial warmth. It whispered promises of heat in the damp streets. It offered a way to close the door against the cold wind, to light a small fire in the hand, and to warm the blood from the inside. The golden leaf had successfully invaded the old world. It had bypassed the defenses of the church and the state by appealing directly to the human nervous system. It was a silent conqueror. It did not need armies. It only needed the lungs of one sailor to tell another, "Try this, brother. It eases the pain." As the chapter closes, picture the night settling over a busy port city like Lisbon. The fog rolls in from the Atlantic, shrouding the masts of the ships in a ghostly white. The taverns are glowing with candlelight. Inside, the air is thick with the new incense. Men from a dozen nations sit together, united by the glowing embers at the tips of their clay pipes and rolled leaves. They are the new congregation. The devil has been forgotten, or perhaps accepted as a drinking companion. The smoke rises to the blackened beams of the ceiling, swirling, dancing, creating a haze that softens the harsh edges of reality. The sailor's secret is a secret no more. It has escaped the velvet pouches and the sea chests. It has woven itself into the fabric of daily life. The leaf has begun its reign, not as a sacred prayer to the gods, but as a lethal comfort to the mortal. The age of the devil's torch has ended, and the age of the global addiction has begun. Silent and pervasive as the fog outside, waiting for the dawn of the plantation and the empire of smoke that is yet to rise. As the great wheel of history turned, leaving the medieval darkness behind and entering the illuminated corridors of the Renaissance, the leaf began a profound transmutation. It was no longer the rough, spiritual tool of the jaguar priest in the jungle, nor was it merely the secret comfort of the salt-crusted sailor shivering on the docks of Seville. The plant was about to shed its savage reputation, molting like a serpent to reveal a new, glistening skin. It was preparing to don the powdered wig of aristocracy, to step out of the shadows of the forecastle and into the candlelight of the royal court. This is the story of how a heathen weed became a divine herb, and how the most addictive substance on earth was welcomed into the heart of Europe, not as a vice, but as a miracle. Picture, if you will, the city of Lisbon in the middle of the 16th century. It is a city of stone and tile, perched on the edge of the known world, looking out over the Tagus River toward the Atlantic. It is the sensory capital of Europe, a place where the air is perpetually thick with the sense of empire, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, pepper from India, and the wet, salty tang of the ocean. In this bustling golden city, there lived a man named Jean Nicot. He was the French ambassador to Portugal, a man of letters, a diplomat, and a scholar with a keen eye for the botanical treasures that were pouring in from the New World. Nicot was a man of his time, a Renaissance humanist who believed that nature held the keys to human perfection. He walked the gardens of Lisbon, where exotic plants from the Americas were kept as curiosities. There, amidst the strange blooms of the passion flower and the agave, he found the tobacco plant. It was tall, proud, and topped with delicate pink flowers that seemed to shy away from the harsh noon sun. But it was not the flower that interested Nicot. It was the leaf. He had heard the stories from the sailors, stories of how the natives used the leaf to cure wounds, to banish fatigue, and to soothe the spirit. Nicot approached the plant not with the fear of the inquisitor, but with the curiosity of the alchemist. He saw in its green, fuzzy texture a potential panacea, universal cure. He began to experiment. He grew it in his own garden, tending to it with the care one might give to a rare orchid. He crushed the leaves, he distilled them, he made ointments and powders. And then he began to apply them. The legend tells us of a man in Lisbon with a tumor growing on his face, a disfigurement that no physician could heal. Nico applied a poultice of the crushed green leaf. Over weeks of treatment, the tumor reportedly shrank and vanished. Whether this was the placebo effect, the natural course of the illness, or the antiseptic properties of the plant, to the 16th century mind, it was nothing short of a miracle. The news spread through the diplomatic channels like a fire in dry grass. The ambassador had found the holy herb. But the true ascension of the plant required a royal patron. It needed a crown. And so, Nico turned his eyes toward Paris, to the most powerful woman in Europe, Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France. Picture the French court of the late 1500s. It is a world of crushing opulence and deadly intrigue. The Louvre is a labyrinth of velvet curtains, tapestries depicting hunting scenes, and cold marble floors. The air is heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies masked by heavy perfumes, musk, ambergris, and rosewater. In the center of this web sits Catherine. She is a woman of immense intellect and immense suffering. She is plagued by blinding migraines, headaches so severe that they render her incapacitated, forcing her to retreat into the darkness of her chambers, away from the light and the noise of the court. Jean Nicot, seeking favor and perhaps genuinely wishing to alleviate her pain, sent the queen a box of his new discovery. But he did not send her the rough cigars of the sailors. He sent her a fine, golden dust tobacco that had been dried, cured, and ground into a powder as soft as silk. He instructed her not to smoke it, but to inhale it, to snuff it. Imagine the moment of the first dose. The queen sits at her vanity, her face pale with pain. The candle flickers in the drafty room. She opens the small, ornate box sent from Lisbon. Inside lies the brownish gold powder. She takes a pinch between her thumb and forefinger, a gesture that will be mimicked by millions for centuries to come. She brings it to her nose and inhales sharply. The reaction is immediate. The sharp, peppery dust irritates the nasal membrane. She sneezes. And in that violent expulsion of air, the pressure in her sinuses is relieved. The massive dose of nicotine hits the bloodstream through the thin mucous membranes of the nose, rushing to the brain in seconds. The blood vessels constrict. The dopamine floods the system. The headache, miraculously, recedes. The clouds of the migraine are lifted, replaced by a sudden crystalline clarity. To Catherine, this was not chemistry. It was divine intervention. She declared the powder to be a true medicine. In her honor, the plant was given names that reflected its royal status: Herbe de la Reine, the Queen's herb, or Catherinaire. But history, in its way, honored the diplomat more than the queen. The plant's botanical name became Nicotiana, and the active alkaloid within it, the molecule that locked the chains of addiction, was named nicotine. Jean Nicot had achieved immortality, though perhaps not the kind he had intended. With the Queen's endorsement, the floodgates opened. The leaf shed its association with the savage and the sailor, and became the ultimate symbol of sophistication. To use tobacco was to be like the Queen, but one did not smoke it in the presence of royalty. That was too crude, too fiery. One snuffed it. The ritual of snuff-taking became a complex social dance, a language of the hands. Picture the courtiers in their silks and doublets, gathering in the Hall of Mirrors. They do not merely take a drug, they perform a ceremony. They pull out their snuff boxes, exquisite objects made of gold, silver, tortoiseshell, or porcelain, often encrusted with diamonds or painted with miniature pastoral scenes. To own a beautiful snuff box was as important as wearing a fine sword. They tap the lid, a sharp click-click to settle the powder. They open it with a flourish. They offer a pinch to a neighbor, a gesture of friendship and alliance. The dust is inhaled. The handkerchiefs are produced, fine linen lace to dab away the residue. The sneeze that follows is not suppressed, it is celebrated. It is seen as the body expelling the evil humors, the stagnation of the brain. The medical theories of the time supported this enthusiasm entirely. We must remember that this was an era dominated by the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a balance of these fluids. Sickness was an imbalance. Tobacco was classified by the physicians of the Renaissance as hot and dry. Therefore, it was the perfect antidote for conditions that were cold and wet. Since the brain was seen as a cold, wet organ full of phlegm and mucus, tobacco was the ideal agent to dry it out and warm it up. It was prescribed for runny noses, for chest congestion, for dropsy, and for the damp melancholia that plagued the soul. The sneezing caused by snuff was interpreted as the physical expulsion of this excess moisture. Every time a courtier sneezed, they believed they were literally clearing their mind of sickness. This was the golden age of ignorance. It is a tragic irony, viewed through the lens of modern history, to see the lethal leaf embraced as a healer. Walk with me now into the shop of a royal apothecary in Paris or London around the year 1600. It is a place of shadows and strange smells. Dried herbs hang from the rafters in bunchesage, rosemary, wormwood, and now the broad, brown leaves of tobacco. Jars of ceramic and glass line the shelves, bearing Latin labels written in a spiderweb script. On the counter sits a heavy brass mortar and pestle. The apothecary, a man in a heavy robe, treats the tobacco with the reverence of a priest handling a relic. He grinds it into powder for snuff. He boils it into a syrup for coughs. He mixes it with lard to create salves for skin diseases. He rolls it into pills. He even prepares it for use in enemas, believing that the smoke, blown into the body, could revive the drowned or cure severe intestinal blocks. The plant was ubiquitous. It was the aspirin, the penicillin, and the Prozac of its day, all rolled into one. There was almost no ailment for which tobacco was not suggested. A toothache? Chew a piece of the leaf to numb the gum. A cut or a gunshot wound? Bind a fresh tobacco leaf over the injury to stop the bleeding and prevent rot. Asthmatic wheezing? Smoke a pipe to open the lungs. It seems madness to us now, a paradox where the cause of the disease was used as the cure. But the relief tobacco provided was real, even if it was deceptive. It numbed the nerves. It provided a dopamine hit that masked the symptoms of fatigue and hunger. It made the patient feel better, even as it began its slow molecular work on their heart and lungs. The illusion of health was powerful. The leaf became a companion to the scholar and the king alike. Leave the bustling court for a moment and step into the quiet, dust-mote-filled silence of a Renaissance library. Here, the walls are lined with leather-bound tomes of Greek and Latin. A solitary scholar sits at a heavy oak desk, illuminated by the single, wavering flame of a beeswax candle. He is working on a translation of Plato, or perhaps a treatise on navigation. His eyes are tired. His mind is foggy from hours of concentration. On the desk, next to the inkwell and the quill, sits a clay pipe and a small pouch of tobacco. He packs the bowl, a slow, deliberate movement that allows him a moment of pause. He lights it from the candle. The smoke curls up, blue and gray, wrapping around the velvet curtains, drifting toward the high ceiling. He inhales. The nicotine strikes. His focus sharpens. The words on the page seem to snap into focus. The fatigue lifts. To the intellectual of the 17th century, tobacco was not a vice. It was a tool of the trade. It was believed to sharpen the wits, to drive away the vapors of sleepiness. It was the fuel of the Enlightenment. Philosophers, poets, and scientists smoked as they wrote, weaving the gray haze into the very fabric of Western thought. They praised it in sonnets. They wrote odes to the divine plant. It was the great equalizer of the mind, a way to access a higher plane of concentration. But the leaf was not content to stay in the pipe or the snuff box. It began to shape the very geography of the cities. In London, the tobacco houses began to appear, precursors to the coffee shops. These were places where men gathered not just to drink ale, but to smoke. The air in these establishments was so thick it was said you could cut it with a knife. But this atmosphere was considered healthy. During the great plagues that swept through London, tobacco was rumored to be a protective shield. The smoke was thought to purify the air, to kill the miasma that carried the disease. Picture the tragic scene of schoolboys at Eton College in the mid-1600s being ordered by their masters to smoke pipes every morning before lessons. This was not rebellion, it was mandatory health and safety. The boys who refused to smoke were whipped, punished for endangering their health by rejecting the protective power of the leaf. The world had turned upside down. The poison was the medicine, and the abstinence was the crime. As the habit spread from the palaces of France to the courts of England, brought by figures like Sir Walter Raleigh, the allure of the golden leaf became unstoppable. Raleigh, the dashing adventurer, brought the custom to the court of Elizabeth I. Legend tells us of a servant who, seeing Raleigh smoking for the first time, threw a bucket of water over him, believing his master was on fire. But the fire could not be put out. Raleigh, smoking a pipe of silver, puffed his way into the history books, even taking a final smoke before his execution, a last comfort before the axe fell. The economic engines began to turn. The demand for this medical miracle was insatiable. The apothecaries could not grind it fast enough. The ships could not bring it fast enough. The alchemist's vial, once a place for rare and precious experiments, was now filled with a commodity that was becoming as common as bread. The price of tobacco began to stabilize, moving from a luxury of the ultra-rich to a comfort available to the merchant and the soldier. But amidst this haze of acceptance, there were voices of dissent. King James I of England, a man of dour disposition and fearful intellect, was one of the first to see through the illusion. In his famous treatise, A Counterblast to Tobacco, he described the habit with a visceral disgust that rings true today. He called it a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He saw the black phlegm it produced. He saw the enslavement of the will. He saw the stinking fume that resembled the smoke of the bottomless pit. But even a king could not stop the tide. He raised taxes on the import, hoping to crush the trade. Instead, he only created a black market and, eventually, a massive source of revenue for the crown. The economic addiction of the state was beginning to mirror the chemical addiction of the subject. The gold that flowed into the treasury was too heavy to ignore. The leaf had conquered the throne in more ways than one. Let us return to the image of the alchemist's vial. The alchemists sought to turn lead into gold, to find the elixir of eternal life. In a strange, twisted way, tobacco fulfilled their promise. It turned the green leaves of the new world into the gold of the old world commerce. And while it did not grant eternal life, quite the opposite, it granted the illusion of a better life. It offered a reprieve from pain, a pause in the relentless grind of existence. The tragedy lies in the innocence of the era. These were not men and women willfully destroying themselves. They were people seeking relief. They were the queen with her migraine, the scholar with his writer's block, the soldier with his cold limbs. They reached for the leaf because they were told it was a gift from God. They welcomed the golden leaf of lethal comfort into their bodies with gratitude. As the 17th century matured, the medical facade began to crack, but only slightly. The recreational use overtook the medicinal pretext. People smoked because they liked it, because they needed it, because their bodies screamed for it when they stopped. The cure had become the condition. The freedom of the mind had become the chain of the spirit. The chapter closes on a scene of quiet, opulent melancholy. Picture a grand European palace at night. The snow is falling outside, blanketing the formal gardens in white silence. Inside, the fire roars in the hearth. A figure stands by the window, a duke, or perhaps a wealthy merchant gazing out at the dark. He holds a pipe of white clay, the stem long and elegant. He takes a draw. The bowl glows red, a small, breathing ember in the twilight of the room. He exhales a long, slow plume of smoke. He feels a deep, settling peace. He does not know that the tar is coating his lungs. He does not know that the smoke is hardening his arteries. He only knows that for this moment, he is content. The leaf has done its work. It has whispered its lie, and he has believed it. The golden age of ignorance is at its zenith, a beautiful gilded trap that has snapped shut on the civilization of the West, holding it in an embrace that is as warm as it is deadly. The alchemist has failed to find the elixir of life, but he has found the perfect palliative for the slow march toward death. And the world, lulled by the rhythm of the breath and the smoke, drifts deeper into the dream. Chapter 4. Green Gold and the Soil of Sorrow. The narrative current pulls us away from the velvet courts of Europe and the marble halls of the Renaissance, dragging us across the gray, heaving Atlantic to a place of raw, unpolished ambition. We arrive at the edge of a new wilderness, where the air hangs thick and heavy with humidity, and the sound of the world is not the polite rustle of silk, but the drone of the cicada and the lap of brackish water against muddy banks. We find ourselves on the humid, fertile shores of the James River in Virginia. It is the early 17th century. The light here is different, sharper, fiercer, filtered through the towering pines and the ancient oaks that line the water's edge. This is the cradle of the English Empire in the Americas, but for a long time it was a cradle that rocked only death. Picture, if you will, the settlement of Jamestown in its earliest, darkest years. It was a precarious foothold on a continent that seemed determined to reject the intruders. The men who came here were dreamers and second sons, searching for the glittering myths of the age, gold nuggets lying in the riverbeds, a passage to the Orient, or perhaps a lost civilization to trade with. Instead, they found a swamp. They found fever that burned the mind and ague that shook the bones. They found a starving time where the dead were piled in shallow graves, and the living moved like ghosts through the palisades, gnawing on shoe leather and hope. The colony was a failure, waiting to be erased by the forest. The Virginia Company in London was bleeding money. They had tried to produce glass, silk, pitch, and tar, but every enterprise collapsed under the weight of the harsh environment and the lack of expertise. The settlement was on the brink of abandonment, a tragic footnote in the history of exploration. It needed a miracle. It needed a reason to exist. It needed a commodity that could bridge the vast distance to London and turn the red clay of Virginia into gold. Enter John Rolfe. He is a figure often overshadowed in the history books by the more martial Captain John Smith, but in the biography of the Leaf, Rolfe is the central protagonist, and perhaps the unwitting architect of a tragedy that would span centuries. Rolfe was a shipwreck survivor, a man who had lost his child and his wife to the journey, a man with nothing left to lose but his ambition. He was a smoker, a devotee of the pipe, but he found the native tobacco of Virginia, Nicotiana rusticato, be too harsh for the refined English palate. It was the bitter herb of the shaman, powerful and biting, not the sweet scent that the gentleman of London craved. The sweet tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum, was a jealously guarded secret of the Spanish Empire, grown in the colonies of Trinidad and Venezuela. To sell the seeds to a foreigner was a crime punishable by death. The Spanish monopoly was absolute, yet somehow history does not record exactly how, leaving us to imagine a dark exchange in a Caribbean port, or a stolen pouch hidden in a boot. Rolfe acquired the forbidden seeds. Picture the moment in 1612 when Rolfe steps out into the humid Virginia morning. The mist is rising off the river, the soil is dark, loamy, and rich with the decay of millennia. He creates a small seed bed. The seeds of tobacco are impossibly small, like dust or ground pepper. A single ounce contains over 300,000 seeds. He scatters them with a prayer and a tremble of the hand. He covers them lightly. He waits. When the shoots emerged, they were not the scrubby dark leaves of the native plant. They were broad, pale green, and velvety. They grew with a vigor that astonished the settlers. The plant loved the Virginia soil. It drank the heat and the rain, shooting up 6, 7, 8 feet toward the sun. When Rolf harvested the first crop and cured it, the smell was unmistakable. It was sweet, nutty, and aromatic. It was the scent of money. He packed a small amount and sent it to London on the next ship. The reaction in the capital was electric. The Virginia leaf was declared equal to, if not better than, the Spanish product. Suddenly, the colony had a purpose. The gold they had been digging for was not mineral. It was botanical. It was green gold. The transformation of Jamestown was immediate and manic. The tobacco craze swept the settlement. Picture the wooden fort, once a place of military discipline and despair, now turned into a sprawling farm. The streets were dug up to plant tobacco. The marketplaces were filled with green stalks. Even the graveyards were not spared. The leaf grew between the wooden crosses of the fallen, drawing its life from the very bodies of those who had died trying to conquer the land. The determination to plant was so consuming that the governor had to pass laws forcing men to plant corn, lest they starve to death with their pockets full of tobacco money. The landscape began to change. The forests were felled, the great trees ringing out as they were struck by the axe, to clear land for the voracious crop. The plantation system was born. These were not yet the white-pillared mansions of later mythology, but rough, working farms carved out of the wilderness, stretching along the banks of the James, the York, and the Rappahannock rivers. The rivers were the highways. Every planter built a wharf at the end of his field, so the ocean-going ships could sail right up to his door, unload furniture and wine from England, and load the heavy hogsheads of tobacco. But beneath this lush, verdant beauty, beneath the rustling of the green gold in the southern breeze, lay a profound darkness. The story of tobacco is inextricably bound to the story of labor, and the soil of Virginia was about to become the soil of sorrow. The tobacco plant is a tyrant. It is one of the most labor-intensive crops on earth. It demands constant, back-breaking attention from the moment the seed is sown until the moment the leaf is packed. It does not allow for idleness. In the spring, the fields must be tilled and hilled. In the summer, the plants must be topped, the flower heads snapped off by hand to force the energy back into the leaves. This leaves a wound that must be tended. Then comes the suckering, removing the secondary shoots that sprout like hydras. Then the worming, picking off the large green hornworms that can devour a plant overnight. And all of this must be done under the anvil of the Virginia sun, in the suffocating humidity, amidst clouds of biting flies. But there is a more insidious danger. The tobacco plant, when wet with dew or rain, exudes a sticky, resinous gum filled with nicotine. When a worker walks through the rows, their skin brushes against the leaves. The nicotine is absorbed directly into the bloodstream. It causes green tobacco sickness, a poisoning characterized by nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and a weakness so profound the worker collapses in the mud. The plant literally fights back against the hand that tends it. To feed this hunger for labor, the colony first turned to the indentured servant. These were the poor, the desperate, and the criminal of England. They signed contracts, trading 4 to 7 years of their lives for passage across the ocean and the promise of land at the end of their term. They were packed into ships, treated little better than cattle, and sold on the docks of Jamestown. They were the white gold that harvested the green gold. Picture a young man from the slums of London, used to the cobblestones and the smog, suddenly standing in a Virginia field. The heat is like a physical weight. The row of tobacco stretches to the horizon. His hands are blistered, his back screaming in agony. He is seasoning, the term used for the period of illness and adjustment that killed nearly half of all servants in their first year. If he survived, he was a hardened man. If he died, he was buried in the field, his body becoming fertilizer for the crop that killed him. But the appetite of the global market was insatiable. The indentured servants, who eventually earned their freedom, were not enough. The planters wanted a labor force that never expired, a labor force that could be owned outright. And so, in late August of 1619, a ship appeared on the horizon that would change the soul of the nation forever. It was the White Lion, a Dutch man of war, piratical and battered. It dropped anchor at Point Comfort. The captain needed supplies, food and water. He had no gold to pay. But he had cargo. He traded 20-odd Negroes, stolen from a Portuguese slave ship bound for Mexico, for the provisions he needed. This moment is the hinge upon which the history of the Western Hemisphere turns. Picture the scene on the riverbank. The silence is heavy. The water laps against the hull. The men and women being brought ashore are Angolans, skilled farmers, perhaps Christians, survivors of the Middle Passage. They look out at this strange green land. They do not know that they are the first seeds of a system that will grow to consume millions. They are traded for barrels of grain and meat. They are walked into the tobacco fields. At first, their status was ambiguous, treated somewhat like indentured servants. But the logic of the green gold was ruthless. Tobacco required cheap, permanent labor to be profitable. Slowly, law by law, the chains were forged. The servant became the slave. The human being became the chattel. The soil of sorrow was watered with the sweat of a stolen people. The tragic machinery was set in motion, turning human life into smoke for the pleasure of Europe. The irony is devastating. The very plant that was used by the Native Americans to carry prayers to the gods was now the engine of a hellish commerce. The smoke that was meant to heal was now built on a foundation of suffering. And yet, the fields were beautiful. To stand on the porch of a planter's house and look out over 100 acres of tobacco in full bloom was to see a sea of vibrant green, topped with delicate pink flowers, if they hadn't been topped, waving gently in the wind. It was a landscape of deception. The crop cycle became the calendar of life. The tobacco year dictated everything. In the autumn, the cutting began. The plants were slashed with knives and left to wilt in the sun. Then came the hanging. The heavy stalks were speared onto sticks and hung in great curing barns. Picture the interior of these barns scathed drills of timber, dark and tall. Thousands of plants hang from the rafters like sleeping bats. Fires are lit on the earthen floor to dry the leaves. The air is thick with blue smoke and the sweet, heavy perfume of curing tobacco. It is a smell that clings to hair and skin, a smell of earth and molasses. For weeks, the fires must be tended day and night. The workers, enslaved and free, sleep in the barns, waking every few hours to check the heat. If it is too hot, the barn burns down. If it is too cool, the tobacco rots. It is a delicate dance with fire. As the leaves cure, they turn from green to lemon yellow, then to a rich reddish brown. The chemistry of the leaf is changing, the sugars caramelizing, the ammonia dissipating. Then comes the prizing. The cured leaves are packed into hogsheads giant oak barrels that could weigh 1,000 pounds. A worker would climb inside the barrel, and as leaves were thrown in, he would stomp them down with his bare feet, layer after layer, compressing the harvest into a solid mass. The prize was the lever used to force the lid shut. These barrels were then rolled down the rolling roads, paths beaten hard by the transit of tobacco to the river's edge. Tobacco was not just a crop, it was the currency itself. In Virginia and Maryland, there were no banks and very few coins. A man's wealth was measured in pounds of tobacco. Notes were issued against the tobacco stored in warehouses, circulating like paper money. You paid your taxes in tobacco. You paid your fines in tobacco. The Anglican priests were paid their annual salary in tobacco. 16,000 pounds of leaf, to be exact. Even the price of a wife was measured in the leaf. When the Virginia Company sent tobacco brides to the colony to marry the settlers, the husbands paid 120 pounds of tobacco to cover the cost of their passage. The leaf wove itself into the very DNA of the society. It created a landed gentry, the tobacco lords, who mimicked the aristocracy of England, wearing silk suits and drinking Madeira wine on the edge of the wilderness. They built great brick mansions, Westover, Shirley, Stratford Hall, monuments to the wealth the leaf provided. But the foundation of these houses was the dark soil and the darker institution of slavery. And always, the ships came. The Virginia fleet was a lifeline connecting the raw frontier to the cosmopolitan center of the world. Picture the departure of a tobacco ship. The heavy hogsheads are hoisted aboard with block and tackle, the ropes groaning under the weight. The hold is filled to the brim, the hatch is battened down. As the ship sets sail, moving down the wide, slow current of the James toward the Chesapeake Bay and the open ocean, it leaves a wake of commerce and dependency. In London, the arrival of the fleet was a major economic event. The ships would dock in the Thames, the smell of the Virginia leaf mingling with the fog and the coal smoke of the city. The customs agents would swarm the decks, calculating the king's duty. The revenue from tobacco taxes became a pillar of the British treasury. It funded wars. It built navies. The stinking fume that King James so despised was now lining his pockets with gold. The leaf transformed the social fabric of England as well. The tobacco shop became a fixture on every street corner, identifiable by the wooden figure of a Highlander or a Virginian standing guard at the door. Inside, the air was brown and aromatic. Jars of different blends lined the shelves. Orinoco, sweet-scented, kite's foot. Men gathered to smoke clay pipes, to read the gazettes, and to debate the news of the day. The coffee houses, the birthplaces of democracy and insurance markets, were filled with the haze of tobacco smoke. It was the lubricant of social interaction, the catalyst for the exchange of ideas. But back in Virginia, the soil was beginning to rebel. Tobacco is a heavy feeder. It strips the nitrogen and potash from the earth with a voracious appetite. After 3 or 4 years of tobacco, a field was exhausted, leaving the soil gray and sandy, unable to support life. The planters were forced to abandon their fields and clear new land, cutting deeper into the forest, pushing further west. This need for fresh land drove the expansion of the colony. It pushed the settlers into conflict with the Native American tribes, the Powhatan, the Monacan, whose lands were being devoured by the hungry crop. The green gold was a parasite that required a constantly expanding host. It left behind a trail of old fields, overgrown with scrub pine and sedge, a landscape of depletion. The soil of sorrow refers not just to the fields worked by the enslaved, but to the land itself, used up and discarded. The ecological cost of the golden leaf was immense. The rivers silted up with the runoff from the plowed fields. The forests vanished. The balance of the natural world was upset by the monoculture of the export economy. Yet, the cycle continued. The demand in Europe grew every year. Russia, Turkey, China, the world was waking up to the leaf. The planters of Virginia were trapped in a golden cage. They were rich in land and slaves, but often debt-ridden to the merchants in London. They were dependent on the fluctuating price of a single commodity. When the price was high, they lived like kings. When the price fell, they faced ruin. But they could not stop. They were addicted to the crop, just as the smoker was addicted to the smoke. As we gaze back at this era through the misty lens of history, we see a tableau of breathtaking contradictions. We see the elegant planter in his wig, writing essays on liberty, while his wealth is generated by human bondage. We see the beautiful velvety green leaves reaching for the sun, hiding the exhausted gray soil beneath. We see the ships sailing for London, carrying the comfort of the world in their holds, leaving behind a legacy of strife and division that would eventually tear the nation apart. The green gold built the United States. It was the product that allowed the colonies to survive and eventually thrive. It bought the guns of the Revolution. It paid the debts of the new nation. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, they were all tobacco men, their lives shaped by the rhythm of the planting and the harvest. But the roots of the plant were tangled deep in the sorrowful history of a divided world. The smoke that rose from the clay pipes of the founding fathers was flavored with the tragedy of the field. The sun sets over the James River. The water turns to liquid copper. The call of the whippoorwill echoes from the edge of the forest. The fields are quiet now. The workers return to their quarters. But the plant stands sentinel in the twilight, row upon row, silent and powerful. It has conquered the soil. It has conquered the economy. And it is waiting for the morning, for the cycle to begin again, the eternal, demanding cycle of the seed, the sweat, and the smoke. The era of the lethal comfort has truly begun, anchored in the rich, dark earth of a new world, fed by the waters of sorrow. The slow, organic rhythm of the agricultural world, the world of the sun, the rain, and the hand-rolled leaf, began to falter as the timeline of history bent toward the iron geometry of the 20th century. Time itself seemed to accelerate. The gentle ticking of the grandfather clock was replaced by the frantic mechanical pulse of the piston in the gear. We leave behind the velvet quiet of the royal courts and the sun-drenched sorrow of the Virginia plantations to enter an era defined by steam, steel, and a new kind of silence, the silence of the assembly line. In the late 19th century, a machine was born that would alter the biography of the leaf forever. Before this moment, tobacco was a thing of patience. A pipe required a ritual of packing and tamping. A cigar was a work of art, rolled by skilled fingers. But the modern world had no time for patience. It demanded speed. It demanded efficiency. And so, the Bonsack machine began to churn. Picture this mechanical beast, a contraption of brass levers, rolling belts, and clicking shears, sitting in a factory in Durham, North Carolina. It did not breathe, yet it exhaled. It inhaled the dried golden leaf and exhaled perfectly uniform, white paper tube cigarettes at a rate of hundreds per minute. The cigarette was no longer a curiosity of the French or the Turks. It was an industrial product, standardized, packaged, and ready for a world that was about to catch fire. The handcrafted soul of the plant was encased in a machine-made shell. It was the democratization of the smoke. It was light, it was portable, and it was instant. It was a product designed for a new kind of human being, the soldier of the industrial age. As the calendar turned to the fateful year of 1914, the world held its breath. The old empires of Europe, like dry timber, were waiting for a spark. When it came, the conflagration was unlike anything the species had ever witnessed. The war did not move with the gallantry of cavalry charges and colorful banners. It sank into the earth. It dug in. It became a war of stagnation, of mud, and of waiting. Picture, if you will, the landscape of the Western Front. It is a scar across the face of France and Belgium, a jagged line of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The sky here is a perpetual gray, heavy with low clouds and the smoke of coal and cordite. The ground has been churned by artillery until it resembles the surface of a dead, moon-cratered, waterlogged, and stripped of all green life. The trees are shattered stumps, skeletal fingers pointing accusingly at the heavens. In this landscape of desolation, where the rain falls like iron and the mud swallows the boots of men, we find the protagonist of our chapter, the common soldier. He is young, perhaps 18 or 20. He is cold, soaked to the skin, and living in a hole in the ground that smells of wet wool, chloride of lime, and fear. His world has shrunk to a few yards of dirt wall and a sliver of sky. In this environment, stripped of all civilization, stripped of warmth and comfort, the soldier reaches into his tunic pocket. His hand finds a small rectangular tin or a paper packet. He draws out a cigarette. This moment, the striking of the match in the dark, is a scene of profound, tragic beauty. In a world defined by the flash and bang of destruction, the flare of the match is a tiny, controlled star. It is a moment of creation in a landscape of negation. The soldier cups his hands around the flame, a protective gesture that shields the light from the wind and from the eyes of the enemy's snipers. He brings the fire to the tip of the white paper. He inhales. The tip glows a small, breathing ember, a cherry of heat. The smoke fills his lungs, and in that inhalation something miraculous happens. The shaking of the hands, caused by the adrenaline of the bombardment, begins to steady. The gnawing emptiness of the stomach, fed only by cold bully beef and hard biscuits, is suppressed. The mind, which has been racing with the terror of the upcoming whistle blow, finds a sudden, quiet center. The cigarette was not merely a delivery system for nicotine. It was the soldier's gray ghost, a companion that haunted the trenches alongside the living. It was the only friend that did not speak, the only friend that did not scream, the only friend that did not die. Or rather, it died willingly, turning into ash to provide a few minutes of solace. It was a measuring stick of time. A soldier would not say, "We attack in 10 minutes." He would say, "Time for 2 smokes." It broke the agonizing weight into manageable units of breath and fire. The smoke drifted over the battlefields, a gray mist mingling with the morning fog and the yellow haze of mustard gas. It rose from the British Tommies in their khaki, from the French poilus in their horizon blue, and from the German soldiers in their field gray. It was the one thing they all shared. Across the wasteland of no man's land, amidst the barbed wire and the unexploded shells, the same ritual was being enacted in mirror image. The enemy was breathing the same smoke. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, of the Christmas truce of 1914. For a brief, shining moment, the guns fell silent. Men climbed out of the trenches, tentative and unarmed. They met in the middle of the frozen wasteland. They did not exchange philosophy or grand speeches. They exchanged what they had. They exchanged buttons, chocolate, and tobacco. A British soldier offering a woodbine to a German soldier, a German offering a cigar or a pipeful of Turkish blend. In the sharing of the leaf, the animosity dissolved. For a moment, they were just men, huddled against the cold, united by the desire for a small comfort. The smoke curled up between them, a fragile peace treaty written in the air, before the officers ordered them back to the killing. The governments of the warring nations understood the power of the leaf. They realized that a soldier without tobacco was a soldier with frayed nerves, a soldier on the brink of collapse. General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, sent a cable to Washington that has echoed through history. "You ask me what we need to win this war. I answer tobacco as much as bullets. Tobacco is as indispensable as the daily ration. We must have thousands of tons of it without delay." And so, the logistics of empire were turned toward the supply of smoke. Ships that braved the U-boat-infested Atlantic carried crates of ammunition and crates of cigarettes side by side. The ration was formalized. Every soldier was entitled to his daily smoke. It was considered a vital nutrient of morale. The Red Cross, the YMCA, and women's knitting circles on the home front organized drives to send smokes to the boys. Picture the arrival of the mail cart in the trench. The mail bag is dumped out in the mud. There are letters from mothers and sweethearts, smelling of lavender and home. And there are cartons of cigarettes. To the soldier, this was a validation. It was a message from the civilization he was fighting for, saying, "We know you are suffering. Here is a small mercy." The cigarette became a symbol of patriotism, of home, of connection. To smoke was to participate in the war effort. To provide smoke was a charitable act of the highest order. The irony, of course, is crushing. The mercy was a poison. The comfort was a carcinogen. But, in the context of the trench, the concept of long-term health was an absurdity. When death can come at any second from a sniper's bullet or an artillery shell, who worries about the lungs in 20 years? The soldier lived in the eternal now, and in the eternal now, the cigarette was a lifeline. It was a soft embrace in a hard world. The narrative of the cigarette in war is filled with poignant cinematic images. Picture the pilot of a biplane, wrapped in leather and fur, flying alone in the freezing upper atmosphere. The cockpit is open to the wind. The engine roars. He has a cigarette clamped between his lips, the ash whipped away instantly by the slipstream. It is his warmth in the void. Picture the wounded man on the stretcher, waiting for the medics. His face is pale, his eyes wide with shock. A nurse or a fellow soldier leans down. They do not offer water, for he might have a stomach wound. They do not offer words, for there are no words for his pain. They offer a lit cigarette. They place it gently between his lips. He takes a drag. The tension in his face relaxes. It is the last sacrament of the battlefield, the final kindness one human can offer another before the darkness falls. The dying man's last smoke became a trope of cinema and literature because it was a reality of the front. The leaf was the anesthetic for the soul when morphine was not enough. As the war ground on, dragging the world through 4 years of slaughter, the cigarette cemented its hold on the generation. The men who went into the war as farmers used to pipes, or as city boys who had never smoked, came out as chain smokers. The addiction had been forged in the fire. The neural pathways had been rewired under the most extreme stress imaginable. The brain had learned a powerful lesson. When there is fear, smoke. When there is sorrow, smoke. When there is boredom, smoke. When the armistice was finally signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. The war to end all wars was over. But the gray ghost did not demobilize. The soldiers returned home, bringing their invisible wounds and their visible habits. The cigarette came back with them to the farms of Iowa, the streets of London, and the villages of Bavaria. It became a permanent fixture of the interwar years, a symbol of the modern, nervous energy of the Jazz Age. But the story of the soldier and the leaf does not end in 1918. History has a way of repeating its tragedies. 2 decades later, the world was plunged into darkness again. World War II brought the mechanical roar to a new crescendo. The tank replaced the horse. The bomber replaced the biplane. But the cigarette remained the constant. In the Second World War, the cigarette was even more ubiquitous. It was branded. It was the era of the Lucky Strike, the Camel, the Chesterfield. The branding became part of the soldier's identity. The packaging was olive drab to save green ink for camouflage. "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war," the advertisements proclaimed. The cigarette was depicted in the hands of the rugged hero, the pin-up girl, and the stoic leader. Roosevelt smoked a cigarette in a long holder. Churchill chugged a cigar. Stalin smoked a pipe. The smoke swirled around the maps at Yalta and Tehran, shaping the fate of nations. Picture the American GI in the hedgerows of Normandy. He is far from home, fighting a determined enemy. He carries his M1 Garand rifle, his canteen, and his carton of cigarettes. He uses cigarettes as currency. He trades them for fresh eggs with a French farmer. He gives a pack to a starving child in a liberated village. The cigarette is a unit of goodwill, a universal language of exchange in a broken Europe. The image of the liberation is often accompanied by the image of the cigarette. The tank rolls into the town square. The hatch opens. The soldier emerges, dusty and tired. The crowd cheers. A young woman runs up and hands him a bottle of wine. He hands her a cigarette. It was the currency of freedom. But let us return to the trenches of the First World War, for that is where the soul of this chapter truly resides. That is where the bond was forged. The relationship between the soldier and the leaf is a love story, albeit a tragic one. It is a story of intimacy. Consider the sensory experience of the trench at night. It is pitch black. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. You are on sentry duty, standing on the fire step, staring into the abyss of no man's land. You are utterly alone with your thoughts of the friends you have lost, thoughts of the life you might never live. The silence is heavy, broken only by the squeak of a rat or the distant rumble of a train. You cup your hand. You strike the match. The smell of the sulfur is sharp and familiar. The flame illuminates your face for a split second, a young face, lined with dirt and exhaustion. You light the tobacco. You inhale. The glowing tip is your companion. It is a small lighthouse in the ocean of the night. You watch the smoke drift up, over the parapet, toward the enemy lines. You wonder if there is a German boy over there, watching his own smoke drift toward you. In that moment, connected by the gray ghost of the leaf, you are not enemies. You are brothers in suffering, comforted by the same lethal leaf. The cigarette offered a private space in a public hell. In an army, a man has no privacy. He sleeps, eats, and fights shoulder to shoulder with others, but when he smokes, he retreats inside himself. He creates a small wall of smoke between him and the world. It is a moment of meditation. He looks at the ash forming on the end of the cigarette, precarious and gray, and perhaps he sees a metaphor for his own life fragile, burning down, destined to fall. As the decades passed and the medical reality of smoking became known, this chapter of history took on a darker hue. We learned that the governments were feeding their young men poison. We learned that the comfort was a hook that would kill many of them slowly, long after the peace treaties were signed. The veterans of the wars would carry the cough with them for the rest of their lives, a somatic memory of the trenches. But in the sleep-like drift of our documentary, we do not judge. We only observe. We see the tragedy, but we also feel the gratitude. We acknowledge that for the man shivering in the mud of Passchendaele, the cigarette was not a statistic. It was a salvation. It was the thing that kept him sane. It was the warmth that kept his heart from freezing. The gray ghost drifts over the cemeteries of Flanders fields now. The poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. The guns are silent. The mud has healed, covered by green grass. But if you listen closely to the wind, you might catch a faint, ghostly scent, not of cordite or death, but of sweet, cured Virginia tobacco. It is the lingering breath of the lost generation, the exhale of the millions who found solace in the golden leaf. It remains there, suspended in the history of the air, a reminder of the time when a lethal leaf was the only mercy the world had to offer. The mechanical age ground humans down, turning them into cogs in a machine of war. But the leaf, ancient and enduring, offered them a way to feel human again, even if only for the time it took to burn from tip to filter. And so, the smoke rises, curling into the dark sky of history, a silent prayer from the trenches, fading, fading, but never truly gone. We arrive, finally, in the modern twilight. The long day of the leaf, which began in the emerald silence of the Mesoamerican jungle and arced across the oceans to the courts of kings and the trenches of wars, now begins its slow descent into the shadows. We enter the era of the mid-century noir, a time when the world was painted in shades of silver, charcoal, and deep velvet black. It was a time when the smoke did not merely exist in the air, it was the atmosphere. It was the texture of the culture itself, a pervasive, swirling mist that softened the hard edges of the post-war reality. Picture, if you will, the cinematic landscape of the 1940s and 1950s. The camera pans slowly across a rainy street in New York or Paris. The asphalt glistens under the street lamps. A figure stands in the doorway, half hidden by the shadows. He wears a fedora, the brim pulled low. He strikes a match against the brick wall. The flare illuminates his face for a split second. The weary eyes, the stoic set of the jaw, before he brings the flame to the cigarette dangling from his lips. The smoke curls up, catching the light, twisting into shapes that suggest ghosts or question marks. In this visual language, the cigarette was not a prop, it was a character. It was the ultimate signifier. For the detective, it was a tool of contemplation, a way to pause time while he unraveled the mystery. For the femme fatale, with her dark lipstick and silk gown, the long, elegant holder was a wand of seduction. The way she exhaled, slowly, deliberately, Looking through the haze was a signal of power and danger. The smoke swirled around them, knitting them together in a conspiracy of cool. It was the golden age of the aesthetic, where the lethal nature of the leaf was completely hidden behind a veil of glamour. The air in the jazz clubs was thick enough to touch. Picture the Blue Note or Birdland, where the saxophone cried out in the dim light. The musicians played through a fog of their own making. The cigarette resting on the edge of the piano, burning down into a long gray finger of ash, was as much a part of the performance as the notes themselves. It was the incense of the cool, the breath of the artist. In the boardrooms of skyscrapers, men in gray flannel suits made decisions that shaped the world while the ashtrays overflowed. In the restaurants, the white tablecloths were dotted with crystal vessels for the ash. On the airplanes, the cabin was a pressurized tube of blue haze where travelers were served cocktails and cigarettes by smiling stewardesses. It was a world where the leaf had achieved total conquest. It was everywhere. It was in the hands of the doctor, who appeared in magazine advertisements claiming that more doctors smoke Camels. It was in the hands of the suburban mother, taking a moment of respite in her kitchen. It was in the hands of the president. The green gold of Virginia had been refined, packaged, and marketed into a universal passport of social belonging. To smoke was to be an adult. To smoke was to be modern. To smoke was to be alive. But beneath this polished, chrome-plated surface, the biography of the molecule was being quietly written in the laboratories of the curious and the concerned. The leaf, which had successfully hidden its true nature for 500 years, was about to be unmasked. The alchemist's vial, which once held the promise of a panacea, was now being placed under the microscope of pathology. The story of the discovery is a scientific detective story, played out in the sterile silence of research labs. In the early 1950s, researchers like Ernst Winder and Everts Graham began to look closely at the rising tide of a rare disease, lung cancer. Once an anomaly, it was becoming an epidemic. They painted the backs of mice with the tar distilled from cigarette smoke. They waited, they watched, and slowly, tragically, the tumors began to grow. The evidence began to accumulate like the snow in a blizzard, flake by flake, report by report, until the weight of it could no longer be ignored. The chemical structure of the smoke was broken down. The sacred breath of the ancients was revealed to be a cocktail of arsenic, formaldehyde, benzene, and polonium. The spirit that the shaman believed he was inhaling was actually a mutagen, a microscopic saboteur that entered the citadel of the cell and twisted the DNA, the very blueprint of life. The turning point, the moment the gavel struck, came on a Saturday morning, January 11th, 1964. The date was chosen carefully to minimize the panic in the stock markets. Picture the scene in the auditorium of the State Department in Washington, D.C. The room is packed with reporters. The air is tense. The doors are locked. The reporters are handed a book, the Surgeon General's Report on Smoking and Health. Dr. Luther Terry, the Surgeon General, stood at the podium. He was a smoker himself, a man who understood the seductive power of the leaf. But he was also a man of science. He spoke the words that would shatter the illusion forever. He declared that cigarette smoking was a cause of lung cancer in men and a probable cause in women. He linked it to chronic bronchitis and emphysema. He stripped away the romance, the history, and the glamour, leaving only the cold, hard biological fact. The leaf was a killer. The news hit the world like a physical blow. The golden leaf was tarnished instantly. The headline, "Cancer," screamed from every newspaper. The smoker, who had gone to bed the night before believing he was enjoying a harmless, sophisticated pastime, woke up to find he was dancing with death. The betrayal was profound. The friend that had offered comfort in the trenches, the companion in the lonely library, the signal of romance in the movies, it was all a lie. The lethal comfort had been exposed. Now begins the slow, melancholic retreat. The history of tobacco from this point onward is a history of vanishing. Picture the gradual disappearance of the ashtray. It started in the hospitals, then the elevators, then the offices. The heavy glass ashtrays, once the centerpieces of every desk and table, began to be swept away, relegated to the dustbin of history. The no smoking signs, with their red circles and slashes, began to bloom like strange warning flowers on the walls of public spaces. The geography of the smoker began to shrink. The smoking section on the airplane became the last refuge, a bizarre concept where a curtain was supposed to hold back a gas. Then, that too vanished. The smoker was pushed out of the restaurant, out of the bar, out of the building entirely. Picture the modern smoker now. He is no longer the king of the boardroom or the hero of the battlefield. He is a solitary figure standing outside an office building in the rain and the cold. He huddles against the wind, nursing the glowing ember. He is an exile in his own city. There is a sadness to this image, a tragic irony. The activity that was once the ultimate communal bond, shared by the Taino around the fire and the soldiers in the trench, has become an act of isolation. The smoke that once connected man to the gods now separates man from society. The glamour faded into the sterile silence of the hospital corridor. The noir film dissolved into the harsh, fluorescent light of the oncology ward. This is the hardest part of the story to tell, but it must be told with dignity. The biography of the molecule ends here, in the quiet rooms where the machines beep rhythmically. The breath, which was once celebrated as sacred, becomes a struggle. The lungs, the delicate pink bellows of life, have been turned to stone by the tar. There is a profound silence in these rooms. It is the silence of regret, perhaps, but also the silence of a long, complicated relationship coming to an end. The patient looks at the old photographs, the young man with the pack rolled in his sleeve, the laughing woman with the cigarette holder, and sees a stranger. They see a time of innocence, a golden age of ignorance that feels as distant as the Mayan temples. And yet, even in the face of this medical reality, the ghost remains. The history of tobacco is not merely a history of commerce or chemistry. It is a history of human longing. It is the story of our desperate, eternal desire to alter our consciousness, to find a buffer against the sharpness of life. We are creatures who seek comfort. We seek to modulate our moods, to calm our anxieties, to stimulate our minds. The leaf offered us a way to do that. It offered us a dial we could turn. The addiction to nicotine is not just a chemical hook, it is an emotional anchor. For the writer, it was the punctuation mark of the sentence. For the worker, it was the reward for the labor. For the grieving, it was the sigh that made the sorrow bearable. To give it up is to say goodbye to a part of the self. As the smoke clears in the cultural consciousness, as the rates of smoking decline and the fields of Virginia are turned over to soy or housing developments, we are left with the memory of the scent. It is a powerful, haunting echo. You catch it sometimes, walking past an old coat, or stepping into a room where someone has been smoking a pipe. It is sweet, earthy, and dangerous. It smells of dried autumn leaves, of molasses, of fire, and of time. It triggers a deep, ancestral memory. It takes us back to the emerald silence of the jungle, where the shaman first crumbled the leaf. It takes us back to the deck of the wooden ship, where the sailor first found warmth. It takes us back to the trench, where the match flared in the dark. It is a scent that carries the weight of 500 years of history. The golden leaf of lethal comfort leaves behind a complex legacy. It built empires, it funded nations, it created art and literature. It comforted the dying, and, in a cruel twist, it killed the comforted. It was a gift from the gods that became a curse of the modern world. As we reach the end of our journey, let us return to the beginning. Picture, if you will, the tobacco plant growing wild once more. The plantations are gone, the factories are silent. The plant returns to the jungle. It grows in the patch of sunlight, its broad green leaves drinking the humidity, its pink flowers opening to the moon. It is no longer a commodity. It is no longer a killer. It is just a plant. It is Nicotiana, a child of the nightshade family, innocent and potent. The wind rustles the leaves. The sound is like a whisper, a long, slow exhale of history. The smoke has dissipated. The fire has died down. But the embers of its story glow on in the dark, a warning and a memory of the time when we tried to breathe fire and found, for a brief, dizzying moment, that it made us feel like gods. The documentary fades to black. The narration ceases. The only sound is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, clear and deep in the quiet of the night.